Hey everyone, in this tutorial we'll be making this loop that I made a while back. The specific effect we'll be focusing on are these wiggly wormy things. Let's get started. So here we are in Blender 2.83, and the first thing we're going to start with is making one of those little worms. And this is actually a pretty easy one because we're going to use the skin modifier. So I'm going to start off with just a plane, and by default these planes are 2 meters wide, as you can see over here. So I'm just going to tab into edit mode and select these two up here, press M to merge those at the center, M again to do the bottom ones. So now we just have this line, and I'm just going to Control R to put some edge loops in there, and I'm just going to do maybe like 19, so we have 20 different ones. And then I'm going to exit with that still selected. I'm going to add a skin modifier, which is over here. Then I'm going to tab back into edit mode, select everything, and press Control A until we get the proportions that we'd like. You can just scale that down, maybe up a little more. So that looks pretty good. So now that we have this, we just add a displacement modifier to make it wiggle around. I'm just going to add a new texture. I'm just going to call this worms. And I'm going to set this to object, and we'll set this up later. So I'm just going to click this to go into the texture settings and change this to clouds. And as we can see, this is kind of distorting in a way that we don't want, and that's because we need to move the displacement above the skin. And this is still not giving us the result that we want, and that's because it's trying to distort it along the normal, and what we want to do is distort it along the X, so it's going side by side. It's pretty much distorting it like it's a line, like that, whereas if we put the skin up top, it distorts each like face and each point, so just make sure that displace is first in there. And with this setup, I just want to add an empty, and this is what's going to control our displacement. Click on the worm, go over to the displacement modifier, and for object, just select that empty. Now if we move the empty around, you can see it'll start to displace a little differently. And if we move this forward, you can see it's already starting to like get that wiggly effect. But it's looking a little dramatic. I think I'm gonna go into texture settings again. I'm just gonna turn this up to something a little higher. So maybe around 1. That looks good. And so if we were to animate this forward, you can tell that it's moving, but the pattern that it moves along doesn't really change. And so that's why I have this empty, is because I want to animate this very slightly as they're moving forward, and that'll give it a little more like wiggling detail. So I'm going to add a curve for this to animate along. I'm just going to move this up and going to click on our empty and go over here to the constraints and add a follow path. You just want to select that Bezier circle right there. And if this isn't snapped on there, you just want to reset the location with Alt-G, and it should snap onto the curve. So then just make sure you're on frame 0 for this, and press I over offset to insert a keyframe, and then go to the last frame, which for me is 250. I'm just going to set that to 100, which is one complete circle around. Then insert a keyframe there, select both of those, and hit linear. So now this should, when you play it, this should go around the circle, and it should loop back to the beginning and just keep going like that. So now we have this wiggling effect even when it's staying still. So now that we have this, I'm just going to duplicate it a whole bunch, and I'm going to do that by selecting it and going over to the modifiers. Just going to collapse these so we can see it a little better, and I'm going to start adding some arrays. So the first one is going to be sideways like this, and I just want to move this to the very top, and I want to be using the constant offset. And it's going on the x-axis. The reason we want it to be on top is because if it's at the bottom, all of the worms are going to have the same movement because it's displacing it and then duplicating it instead of duplicating it and then displacing all of them separately. So with constant offset checked, I'm going to set the x to 1 meter, and the count I'm just going to turn up to 10. And then I'm just going to copy this, and that should be right below. So for this one, I'm going to turn back down to 2. For the x, instead of 1, I'm going to set that to 0.5, so they're in between the other ones, and I'm going to move this up a little. I'm going to set this to 1.25. Then I'm going to copy this again. And this one is only going to be moved on the y. I'm just going to move this 2.5. So now we have this like kind of staggered effect, and if you turn the displacement off, you can see these gaps should be like lined up with the middle of the ones beside it in kind of like a brick pattern. And so this is the part where I think we should set up the camera, and I didn't start the scene with a camera, so I'm just going to add one in now. And I'm going to press Control G and Control R to reset the location and everything. And I'm just going to press 0 to look through there. And I'm just going to move this up on the Z so we can see it a little better, and just try to kind of center this a little. So now I'm going to add in a plane that's just going to be our ground. So Shift A to add, and then add a plane over here. I'm just going to move that to close to the center also, and scale that on the X until it's filling the frame, and then scale it on the Y. And then I'm just going to press Control A to apply the scale. And we need to do that so our textures look right when we start to texture this. I'm just going to look at this from the side and make sure that this, as you can see, the plane is kind of like halfway in between our worms. I'm just going to pull that down slightly like that. So now we know that anything on this plane is going to be in frame pretty much. So we don't really have to worry about looking through the camera that much anymore. Basically, I'm going to make this move 10 meters on the Y-axis. And I know that 10 meters will loop perfectly because we have this offset by 2.5 meters, and 10 is divisible by 2.5. So basically, like, you can set this to be going at any multiple of 5, and it should loop fine. I'm going to go back to frame 0, and I'm going to move this back to -10 and insert a single keyframe there, and then go to the last frame, and I'm just going to set that to 0 and insert a single keyframe, and then just select both of these keyframes down here, T, and make sure those are set to linear. And so now, as you can see, when we go back to frame 0 and these are back 10 meters, they're not in the plane, so I just need to set this count to be higher. I'm just going to look through the camera and make sure that these are actually on there. So it looks like we need at least 7. And let's just go to the end and see if that loops properly. So looking through our camera, and it looks pretty good. But these look like they're kind of floating along a little bit, and I don't really like that, so I think what I might do is just make this smaller, and that should make it distort less. And if you wanted these to wiggle a little more crazy and not as smooth, you can pretty much just go into the displace and make the size of the texture smaller. So if I set this to like 0.5, these are just going to act a little crazy, a little more crazy, as you can see. And we can also make this circle way bigger, and then it'll wiggle a lot more violently. But that's not really what I'm looking for. So I'm just going to press Control Z a couple times to make that go back. And I want these worms to be shaded smooth, so I'm going to right click and press Shade Smooth like you normally would, and this doesn't change. And it's actually because if you go into the modifiers, you have to make sure that under the skin modifier, smooth shading is ticked right there. And the reason we want to do this has to do with shading, and I'll show you that a little later. So before we get into shading, I'm just going to set up the lighting real quick. So we're using Eevee for this, so I'm going to go into render view mode right here. As you can see, there are no lights in our scene right now. So I'm just going to Shift A to make a light and use a point. I'm just going to turn this up to something really high to start, like 5,000. So I'm going to set one on the side right here. I'm going to duplicate that, put one on the other side, duplicate it again, and push it towards the middle and to the front, like that. Sorry about the flickering. I hope that stops soon. I don't know if it will. I'm just going to move all of these point lights to a separate collection. The camera and lights. I'm also going to move my camera there, just because I like to keep them separated. So for these, I'm just going to give them all slightly different colors. The one over here, I'm going to make red. One over here, I'm going to make blue. And the one in the front, I'm going to leave white. And I'm going to switch into the shading tab over here. So I'm going to start with the worms, so make sure those are selected, and add a new texture over here. I'm just going to name this worm. And for this, we're going to be using two different textures, this principled and an emission. And we're going to mix those with a mix shader, like that. And we're going to control the factor with a wave texture. Actually, I'm going to change this to a different color just so we can see it a little better. I'm going to turn this to like a purpley pink color. Make this a little darker maybe, like that. And I'm going to add a math node to make the waves a little sharper and set that to greater than. And as you can see, these are not going in the direction we want. I want like stripes going down, so I'm just going to set this to Y. And then if we move this around, we can control how thin or thick our waves are. And I'm actually going to control that with another math node set to divide. That way we get more fine-tuned control. Just going to set this second value to 1000, and then we'll control how big or small with the first value. So I'm going to turn that up to something, actually going to start at 1000 and turn it down. That way we get a thin line like that. And I'm just going to turn the emission up really high to maybe like 20 for now. And I'm just going to change the scale a little bit. So maybe make that maybe something around 1. That looks pretty good. We got about 3 stripes per worm. I'm just going to make these a little thinner. That should be good. So now you can see these lines are going straight across, and we want it to kind of like conform to our worm. And this took me a while to figure out, but I did figure it out. I'm just going to press Control-T. If you have the Node Wrangler add-on, that should add the texture and mapping coordinate. And you can leave that set to generated for now. And I'm just going to move the mapping forward right here, and we're going to work in between. So if we preview all of these, we can see the only one that really differentiates between the left and the right side is this normal. And so that's why I'm using that one. And you have to make sure that this is set to smooth shading, because when we turn it off, it just looks at the sides like that. But when you set it to smooth, it'll actually calculate the normals a little differently and make them like smooth around the edges. So back to top view. What I'm going to do is add a math node, but it has to be a vector math node because we're controlling multiple values and not just one. I'll show you the difference. I'm just going to multiply that. And right now this is being multiplied by 0, so it's not being changed yet. And to control all of these at the same time, I'm just going to add a value node. And I just find this a little easier. So I'm going to start at 0, and as you turn it up, you can see these are starting to move in the direction that the worm is like wiggling. And we don't really need this very high at all. And these waves should be moving in the direction like perpendicular to the side of the worm, so this one should be going like that, and that one should be going like that. So for that, we just need to make it negative. I think I'm going to just set it to -0.020. And you have to make sure that this is a vector math node, because if you just use a regular math node set to multiply, I'll show you, it just doesn't work right. Because the vector math node controls 3 values, and the regular math node only controls 1. So if you plug that in, it just doesn't really work right. One other thing I'm going to do to this, and then we're pretty much done, is add a little subsurface. I'm going to set that to 0.1, and I'm also going to make this very shiny, so I'm just going to set this to 0.1 also. And so our worms are done now, and I'm just going to select the plane, click New. I'm just going to name this Ground. Okay, so for this one, we're going to mainly be using a Voronoi texture, so I'm going to add that in, and Shift-Control-Click to preview that. And I'm just going to press Control-T over that to add the texture and mapping, and change that to Object. And for this one, I'm actually going to turn the randomness all the way down so we get this kind of grid. And I'm going to change this from Euclidean to Chebyshev, and it gets a little more square-like. And I'm going to crunch this with a map range node. You can plug it in right there, and I'm going to add in a value and a math node set to add. I'm going to plug the value into the from min, value into the add, and then the add into the from max. And when we move these, you can change how much is being crunched. So I'm going to set this to 0.1. And I'm looking for like a pretty tight grid, so maybe something like that looks good. And I also want these to be rectangular, so I'm just going to change the X to 2, so we have these like vertical rectangles. And this looks alright, but I want it to be a little distorted, so I'm just going to move this texture coordinate back, and I'm going to distort it with a Voronoi texture. So I'm just going to copy that and plug the object into here. And what we're going to do is we're going to use the color to distort the location of our Voronoi texture, of our first one over here. And I just want to distort it on the X and the Y location, but not the Z, because then it like kind of goes up and down and it just flickers. So I'm going to add in a combine XYZ, a math node set to multiply. I'm going to plug the color into the multiply and the multiply into the X and the Y, but we're going to leave the Z at 0, and then we're going to plug that into the location. And you can see it's starting to distort already, but it's kind of fragmented, and to fix that you can change the F1 to smooth F1, and now it's a little noodly. So I'm going to put the multiply to 0, so it's not affecting anything right now. I'm just going to change that very slowly. so it only distorts a little. And then you can affect the smoothness. So I'm going to keep that pretty low, around 0.25. And you can also mess with the scale. So I'm going to turn this down quite a bit and affect the multiply a little more. There you go. And I also want to mess with our randomness for the first one. You can just mess with these values until you get something that you like. So I think that looks pretty good. It's just kind of like distorted tiles. So what we're going to use this texture for is to control a bump map. We can just plug the result of that into the height and then plug the normal into our principled shader. I'm going to view this in our render mode. And also I stopped the flickering. The problem was I just needed more samples in the viewport, so I turned that up to 128. So I'm going to look at that from the side so we can see the bump a little better. I'm just going to turn this distance down to something really low, like 0.001, and that gives us kind of a more realistic result. But it looks like it's coming up, so I'm going to press invert for that. And now it looks like it's going down. And I want to control the color a little also, so I'm going to add a mix RGB in here and plug the texture into the factor over here. And so we're pretty much using it like a mask. Now our plane should be these two colors right here, so you can see like that. So I want the grooves to be dark, so I'm going to make this one white and this one like a dark gray, and I'm just going to make both of these kind of purpley. And you can just mess with the saturation. Now with this done, I'm going to look back through our camera and switch back to render view so we can mess with the lights. And one thing I should point out is I did change the setting of this light right here, and I'll show you why. If we select that and go into Object Data Properties, I have Contact Shadow turn on, because when it's off, some of these look like they're floating when they're actually touching the plane. So if you ever get a problem where the lights are making it look like an object is floating instead of actually touching it, you might have to select that light and press contact shadows, and usually that fixes it. And that just has to do with the way EV calculates lighting. And I think the lighting in this scene actually looks pretty good right now. The only thing is, in my original animation I had some flickering, so I'll show you how to do that real quick. I'm going to go back up here into layout for this, and I'm going to switch back into render view over here and make sure that this white light in the front is selected. I'm going to pull our timeline up and press Control Tab over here, and it should change it to this graph editor. So make sure you're on frame 0 for this, and I'm just going to hover over power and click I to insert a keyframe. In the graph editor, you just want to click the keyframe, and then I'm going to press N to open this side panel over here and go to modifiers and add a noise modifier. And I'm just going to turn the strength up pretty high. As you can see, our values are on the side. So if you press Control in the middle mouse button, you can scale it just in one direction. So I'm just going to scale it down so we can see 0 right there. And I know that our keyframe is at 5,000. To make this loop properly, you want to restrict the frame range to your start and your end keyframe. So I know mine ends at 250, so I'm just going to turn this to 250. And the in and the out is how many frames it takes to transition. So I'm just going to set that to 12, which is half a second if you're at 24 frames per second. And I'm just going to turn strength up really high until we see it going a little closer to 0. And this looks like it's going up and down really fast, so I'm also going to change the scale to something like that. And so now you can drag along to see like the lowest and the highest points. So at like the lowest point is right here, and I think we could go a little closer to black. So I'm going to press A to select our keyframe over here, and then press G so we can move it around, but I want to constrict it to the Y axis, so I'm going to hit Y, then move it down. So this is going to get a little closer to our 0 line right here. And you can just mess with the strength and the scale until you get a result that you like. And if you want this to not just go up and down, but to like flicker more, you can also add a limit and change like the maximum and minimum limit for here, like that. You can set the minimum to something so it doesn't go completely dark. And then if you change the strength to something really high, this is basically just like on and off right here, like that. But I want it to be a little more smooth, so I'm going to turn limits off, and I'm also going to divide that by 10. And I think this is a pretty good look right now. Though when you preview it is a little hard to tell, so unfortunately you just kind of have to like render some frames and see how it looks. If you go frame by frame, you can tell the minimum and maximum brightness. So that's the minimum, and this is close to the maximum, and I think that looks pretty good. So now if you render that out, you should get something pretty close to what I got. If you like this video, consider sharing and subscribing, and comment below if you have a topic to recommend. I post all of my loops over on Instagram, so check me out over there for more. And if you follow along with this, tag me when you post it. I like seeing your results. Thanks for watching, everyone. See ya.